My name is Stefan Arndt, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the seminar series of the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we work and live, in my case, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. It is my great pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Professor Patrick Baker. Patrick is a professor of silviculture and forest ecology in the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He is currently a Charles Bullard Fellow at Harvard University and was previously an NRC Future Fellow. Before coming to Australia, Patrick was a research scientist for the Nature Conservancy of Hawaii and the US Forest Service. His research focuses on native forests, their dynamics, and the factors that influence them. Over the past 20 years, he has worked in 3 separate discipline areas: forest ecology, silviculture, and paleoclimatology, to better understand how forest management might be used to make forests more resistant and resilient to various agents of global change. And today, it's our great pleasure that he will give a seminar on the origins of old growth. Patrick, please.
Thanks, Stefan, very much. Let me just share my screen here. I'll make that the whole screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that without all of the other stuff around it. Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to talk today. Today I'm going to talk about the origins of old growth, and old growth forests are of concern and importance to many people, and probably why a lot of you have come here to listen to the talk today. The talk that I'm going to give builds on some of the work that I've been doing as part of my Bullard Fellowship at Harvard, and some of the work that my PhD students, Karma Tenzin, who's in Bhutan and has been for the last 18 months, and Katie Hammond have been doing, looking at the dynamics of native forests in Bhutan and Victoria, respectively. Before I get started, though, I would like to also acknowledge the country on which I'm based. So I'm in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. So this is Bunurong country, and I work in Burnley on Wurundjeri country. But more to the point, I work in beautiful, beautiful forests and remote places around the world, and I have for a long time now. Many of those forests have had a human presence for centuries or millennia, and I think it's important and fitting that I acknowledge the leaders and people, past, present, and emerging, who have been the custodians of those forests and those landscapes. So, as I mentioned, I've been really lucky and privileged to work in some really spectacular forests, many of them old growth forests in different parts of the world. Probably the place I've spent the most time actually physically living in the forest is here in Western Thailand. So this is the Hoi Ka Keng Wildlife Sanctuary. And I lived in the forest for a little bit over 4 years in the 1990s, and had continued to work there and have ever since I finished my PhD. And the old growth forests that I've worked in, and other old growth forests around the world, I think have captured the public's imagination and scientists' focus for many reasons. And I'm not going to go into really much detail about that at all. I think most people here who are cognizant of the values of old growth forests, they provide an important source of biodiversity, an important source of habitat. They're important for carbon sequestration, for a lot of ecosystem processes. They also, I think, have important cultural, aesthetic, and in some cases spiritual values as well. So for me, this is a picture of me when I was much younger. Again, this is in Hoi Ka Keng in Western Thailand. I think old growth forests are neat because if nothing else, they do give you a bit of perspective, both in terms of your sort of place in the universe on a spatial scale. Obviously, this is me standing next to an extraordinarily large tree. And also, I think in the context of time, right? So they give us a sense for the time that we as humans are around versus some of the more longer-lived organisms of the world. And sort of to give you a bit of a sense of this, I have a 15-year-old daughter, Xylia, and like many 15-year-olds, she's not impressed by very much. She was helping me go through some tree core samples that we have from Tasmania that we collected some years ago, and helping me sort them. And these are old trees, King Billy pine primarily. So one of the trees, one of the tree cores that we were looking at was 700 years old. And I told her, look, you can, put your hand on right down towards the end of the core where the pith is, and the cells in those tree rings were grown 700 years ago, right? So this is in the 1300s, and here it is, this piece of wood in our living room. And as I said, she's a 15-year-old, and very little impresses her, certainly very little that has to do with me and my work. But she was visibly blown away that, trying to imagine what was the world like in the 1300s, I think did make an impression. And I think that's something that's important to really hold on to when we think about growth forests. This is obviously a concern because old growth forests are rare and getting rarer. I'm not going to do a review of the amount of old growth forests around the world. Places like Europe have almost no old growth forests, for example. This is from the Australian State of the Forest report from 2018. And the only thing to notice, thing to focus on is the right-hand column, which is the percentage of old growth forests as part of a review area in the regional forest agreement areas that was conducted as part of the State of the Forest report. And the bottom line down here is 23% of the forests were old growth forests in the area that they looked at in the RFAs in New South Wales, Tasmania, Victoria, and Southwest WA. But the thing that you should notice is that there's a lot of variability there. So Tasmania, in large part because of the WA, the World Heritage Area, has large areas of old growth forest, and particularly in the west. But other areas, Victoria, for example, have much smaller proportions of old growth forest as part of the broader forest estate, and the Central Highlands being somewhat remarkable in having roughly only about 1% of the Central Highlands forest area left as old growth. And so this is a real concern that old growth forests, they provide all of these important functions, both ecologically, biologically, but also in terms of how we as humans relate to these landscapes. Old growth forests are rare. And so it's important that we know about old growth forests and think about old growth forests and how they develop. Okay, and so in the talk that I'm going to give today, there's three pieces that I want to cover. The first one is, how do we typically define old growth forests? And I'll talk about a couple of different aspects of that. The second part is on how is it that old growth forests develop? So what have we learned from the many tree ring studies in particular over the past 50 years that have looked at the dynamics of old growth forests? And then the final piece is, in terms of forest management, is there a role, I guess, for forest management when we think about old growth forests in these broader landscapes? So I'm going to start with the definitions of old growth. So a colleague, Christian Wirth from the University of Leipzig, did a review, published an edited volume about 12 years ago on old growth forests. And one of the chapters, they reviewed various definitions of old growth forest. They looked at 39 papers that had focused specifically on how do we define old growth forests. And they categorized the various criteria into three groups: either structural definitions, so as you can see from the top, big trees, old trees, large logs, and so on. successional definitions or criteria, so that is something related to the dynamics of the forest. For example, gap phase replacement, so gaps forming in the forest canopy, or biogeochemical processes, so the sort of ecosystem processes, nutrient cycling, water cycling, and so on. And then they had another bin here for anything that didn't really fit into those. And what you should notice is that of the top 10 categories or criteria, 8 of those were structural. Okay, so old trees, large logs, large snags. So a snag is a standing dead tree. A multi-layered canopy, structural complexity, gaps in the forest, and so on. The only ones in the top 10 that were not structural was this one, undisturbed by humans. And I think it's important to make the point here, particularly in light of the sort of acknowledgement of country, is that this does not mean that humans haven't been involved in these forests in some way or another. It's in fact a bit of a misnomer. It usually refers to haven't been harvested by Europeans in the last 300 years. And then the only one in the top 10 that's a successional one is this gap phase tree replacement, and that's something that was particularly focused on in the early in the 1980s and 90s. Okay, but the takeaway here is that there's quite a lot of different features that people have used in defining old growth forests, and they fall into a variety of different things. Some are used quite commonly, big trees, old trees, and so on, and some are used much less frequently. Now, just to give you a little bit of a sense, so this is a picture that's taken by my colleague in geography and earth sciences, Michael Fletcher. In addition to being an excellent young scientist, I think I can call Michael young, relative to me. He's also a very talented photographer. And so this is Scott Nichols in the red jacket. He was a longtime technician in my lab in Western Tasmania, standing in front of a big southern beach. Obviously, remarkable tree. Very impressive in this forest. It's important to bear in mind, though, that not all old growth forests are full of big trees. Okay, so this is also an old growth forest from Western Tasmania. So the tree cores that I mentioned that my daughter Xylia was so impressed by come from this forest. So these are 600, 700, 800-year-old trees in here. But none of the trees are terribly big. There's lots of stuff lying on the ground. And actually, in fact, the background of my Zoom thing here is the forest is this forest here that you're looking at. So lots of standing dead trees, but none terribly big. But nonetheless, still lots of very old trees in there, hundreds and hundreds, almost a millennium old. So I wanted to also touch on some of the more formal definitions that are used for management, so used by different state or federal agencies. And I've sort of picked somewhat idiosyncratically from different places that I've lived over the years. So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in the Northeast United States. And there the definition for old growth is simply forests that are greater than 140 years old. It doesn't make any distinction about the size of the trees or gaps in the canopy or dead wood on the ground. In Maine, where I went to university and where my family lives, the definition for old growth forest is a wooded area that has no evidence of harvest or alteration by humans. An old growth forest often has large individual trees, a multi-layered canopy, and a significant accumulation of large woody material, including snags and fallen logs. So this sort of captures a lot of the common features of old growth forests that we think about. So big trees, multi-layered canopy, lots of large dead material, whether standing or lying down, and little evidence of disturbance. The Australian definition, the federal definition from the State of the Forest Report, is ecologically mature forest where the effects of past disturbances are now negligible. And the Victorian definition is as you can see, a little bit longer. And I'm going to read the whole thing from the beginning to the end because it's important in terms of some of the stuff I'm going to come to in a moment. So feel free to close your eyes and just relax and listen to my dulcet tones. The Victorian definition is forest which contains significant amounts of its oldest growth stage, usually senescent trees, in the upper stratum of the canopy and has been subject to any disturbance, the effect of which is now negligible. For a stand to qualify as old growth, the regrowth growth stage, if present, must be sparse, less than 10% of the total crown cover of the stand. Negligibly disturbed forest is that in which disturbance is known to have occurred, but the disturbance is unlikely to have altered the structure or the usual species composition which characterizes given vegetation class. Or if the alteration did occur in the past, it's no longer measurable. Okay, and so obviously the effect of past disturbances being negligible reflects the Australian federal definition, but that's a really key component here, is that disturbance is really not evident anymore. It's not part of the equation. Now, I want to just change gears a little bit and talk about some of the more process-focused definitions that have been used. And so these are sort of more conceptual models of forest dynamics. And I'm going to talk about two briefly. The first one comes from a book written by Herb Borman and Gene Likens. So this is a landmark book that was published in 1979 called Pattern and Process in a Forested Ecosystem. And what they're looking at, or what they show here, is this is time on the x-axis and total biomass of the forest on the y-axis. A disturbance happens, you get a loss of biomass from decomposition and wood being moved around. Before the new trees that establish are able to start growing and accumulate biomass, you see this bit of a depression in the biomass. And then as those newly established trees start to grow and sort of pack on the biomass, you see this what they call the aggregation phase. So stand is accumulating and accumulating biomass. And then it gets to a sort of carrying capacity, and then due to competition for resources and self-thinning, density-dependent mortality, you see some loss of biomass, and then you reach the steady state phase where you have increase, decrease, increase related to mortality and growth. And that stage they associate with what we call the climax forest. And so that's some ideas from the early 20th century ecologists about a forest that is in steady state in terms of both the composition and the structure. The second conceptual model that I want to talk about is probably the most widely used one in forest ecology in the world. This comes from Chad Oliver and Bruce Larson's book, Forest Stand Dynamics. It's published in 1990, updated in 1996. We're in the process of revising it at the moment now, 25 years later. And in Oliver and Larson, they propose the following sort of conceptual model of stand development after a stand replacing disturbance. So you have a disturbance here that impacts the stand, kills all the trees, and you get a period of sort of recruitment where new trees are coming in, whether as seeds from outside or as sprouts from inside the stand. They establish, they grow vigorously, fill up all of the growing space, so they're taking up all the resources. Over time, as the trees get bigger and density-dependent mortality leads to gaps in the forest canopy, light gets through to the understory, you get new trees reestablishing in here, so you see these new trees coming in down here. And then over time, you get to this old growth stage where the trees that establish here in the initial, after the initial disturbance, are a small part of the forest canopy, but other trees that have established have sort of grown up, and you have this more complex heterogeneous forest structure. Okay, and so the key point I want to make here is that in order to get to the old growth stage, you have to go through all of these other stages first. Okay, you have a disturbance, and then it really is a question of time and development to reach these older stages. Now, in some forests, the tropics, for example, that may take less time. And in other forests, boreal forests that are much lower in productivity, that might take a longer amount of time. But the idea is that it's this sort of staged process. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment as we talk about the evidence for the origins of old growth forest. So that's the first piece of this talk, and the key messages that I want you to take away from that. Number one are the definitions of old growth forests vary, but there are some key common features. One of those is the emphasis on the absence of disturbances. We think of old-growth forests as forests that have developed over time, protected from disturbance. And then the last point is that the conceptual models, whether Borman and Likens, Oliver and Larson, Franklin et al., there's quite a number of them out there, really emphasize old-growth forest as the final stage of stand development, right? That you have to go through all these other stages to get there. Okay, so now what I want to do now is to talk about the origins of old-growth forests. So how is it that old-growth forests develop? So we have, I work with colleagues around the world looking at forests using tree rings as a tool. And many dendroecologists, so people who use tree rings to study the ecology of forests, are interested in old-growth forests. There's quite a lot of studies on the history of old-growth forests. So how do we do this? I'll sort of explain what we do, and then I'll tell you sort of what we see. So if we're interested in the dynamics of a forest, we go into, this is an old-growth forest in the Adirondacks National Park. My colleague at Harvard, Neil Peterson, this is his research group doing work in the Adirondacks. And we take these instruments, these are called tree cores that you see here, and we put them into, you screw them into the tree, and you pull out this very thin piece of wood. It's about 5 millimeters wide. And we do this to many trees. This is Karma Tenzin, my PhD student, just been doing this work in Bhutan. You do this for many trees within the stand. You take the tree cores out, you dry them, you prepare them, and you wind up with wood samples, tree core samples that look like this. Okay, so for those of you who might not have seen tree cores or tree rings up close, I thought I'd just show you a few of them. So these are 4 different species from 4 different parts of the world. Acacia dealbata, silver wattle, grows here in southeastern Australia. This is from the Central Highlands. Melia azadirach is a fast-growing pioneer species from continental Southeast Asia and also northeastern Australia, so tropical, subtropical forests. Although, having said that, many of you will know it as a street tree here in Melbourne. Tectona grandis, which you may know as teak, is the 3rd one over. And then the 4th one on the right is the Wallamai pine, Willemia nobilis. Now, each of these pieces of wood is exactly the same size, give or take, some fractions of a millimeter. And what you'll notice, of course, is that the acacia has 4 growth rings in that space from top to bottom. The Melia has 4 growth rings. The teak has 5. And the Wallamai pine has 61. Okay, so there's 61 little rings in that little piece of the Wallamai pine. So very different growth patterns in different trees. And those growth patterns reflect the resources that are available to the trees at the time that they grow, at the time that they're growing. Okay, but we can use this information, the size of the ring and so on, to infer the history of a stand. So how do we do that? We measure the rings in a prepared tree core. So this is a Apsilia xylocarpa from Western Thailand. We use various programs to do this digitally. We measure each of the rings, and it returns to us this figure here, this graphic, and this is the ring width in millimeters on the y-axis, and then these are the years that each ring was formed. Okay, so we spent a lot of time making sure that we've got the rings dated correctly so that we know this ring here is the 1925 ring and this is the 1924 ring. We do have problems with missing rings and false rings, and so we spend a lot of time trying to reduce or eliminate those problems. And then we have this kind of trace that tells you that right at the beginning, when the tree was young, it was growing very fast. It was growing, in this case, over 1 centimeter in radius each year, and then over time that sort of slowed down to much lower growth levels. So when we use tree rings to study forest dynamics, there's 2 things that we do with them. One is we look to see, well, how old are the trees? Okay, and we took many cores from many trees in the stand, and we want to know, are they all the same age? Are they all different ages? Is there, one cohort that's 100 years old and another cohort that's 250 years old? So what do the patterns look like? Okay. And then the other thing that we do is we look at patterns in the growth of the trees. So this is a celery top pine that we collected from southwestern Tasmania. Celery top grows in the understory, often under eucalypts. This is the pith of the tree that we cored. And what you can see is when the tree was young, it was growing very slowly. So each one of these rings here is a millimeter or less in diameter. And it did that for about 25 years. So from here to here is 25 rings. Okay. And then something happened here in this ring here, well, not in this ring, in this year, something happened where suddenly the tree started growing very quickly, right? And we know from silvicultural research, from dendroecological research, that what happened to do this, to create the sudden change, is that there was a disturbance. That something happened and the trees that were above this one, this sapling, were killed, and that provided more light and more resources to this tree. And so it was able to increase its growth rate by a factor of 5 or 6 and sustain that over time. Okay. So those are the two things that we use to sort of piece together the history of stand development in any forest, whether it's old growth or not. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from old growth forest studies that colleagues around the world have looked at. So the first one is from an old growth beech fir forest in the Slovenian Alps. So Slovenia is just to the southeast of Austria. This is mountainous forests. And what you see in the upper left-hand panel, this is the age distribution of all the trees that they sampled in their study plots. And there's clearly a big pulse of recruitment. So lots of new trees establishing here in the sort of mid to late 1800s. But there are also trees that established in the early 1600s, the mid 1600s, and there's quite a few here that established in the early 1700s. Okay, so we have a pulse of recruitment, which is evidence of a disturbance, and that's what that arrow indicates here in the mid 1800s. Now we can also look at the individual growth patterns of individual trees, and you see that here with this Abies alba, where this tree established in the late 1600s, but basically it didn't grow, right? So these are ring widths that are probably only half a dozen or a dozen cells wide, so super narrow rings. And it did that for the better part of 150 years, where it basically didn't grow at all. And then something happened around 1860, 1862, where suddenly the tree exploded in terms of growth. So increased growth by about 1,500%, and then persisted at higher growth rates for quite some time. Okay, so this is an old growth forest that had old trees, or trees that had established a long time ago, but that was impacted by a very substantial disturbance in the mid 1800s. And we know it was substantial based on the amount of recruitment of new trees and the growth response of the trees that predated the disturbance. Okay. This is another example. So this is old growth hinoki forest from central Japan. The only difference here is that the x-axis is switched, so the young forest is to the left and older ages are to the right. And what you can see in a number of the species, in the oak on the right here, and the hinoki at the top, and the other Chemicipparis, is there's clearly an age cohort that established around 300 years before the study, and then there's another one that established around 70 years before the study. So again, study of old growth forest looks at the age distribution in this case and identifies very discrete historic cohorts that are indicative of past disturbances. Okay. Now, this is an interesting study because it's the one, as I'll get to in a moment, is one exception. Here, this is ponderosa pine from the western US, and this is the age distribution of the ponderosa pine in this the D panel down here. So you've got trees going back to the 1500s. Sorry, my mouse. Back to the 1500s. What's interesting here, these are fire scars in the middle panel, and they show where there's evidence of fire. And here in these forests, recruitment is associated with an absence of disturbance. Okay, so you have, this is a climate reconstruction here, and this is relatively cool, wet periods. And during those periods, you don't have fires. You can see that there's very few fire scars down through these green bands. And that's when we get pulses of recruitment in these forests. Okay, so in this case, this is a high frequency, low intensity disturbance system. And when you remove that, those disturbances, because you have cooler, wetter conditions, you get these pulses of recruitment. So again, old growth forests driven by disturbance and changes in the growing conditions where you have these discrete periods of recruitment in the past. So we wanted to know, well, how frequent is it? How common is this pattern? Because typically we think of old growth forests as being forests that are not impacted by disturbance. And just to go back to the Victorian and Australian, and also the main definitions of old growth, these are forests that don't show evidence or negligible evidence of disturbance. And so Karma, as part of his PhD, and I have been sort of working through the literature on this, and I think we're up around 62 studies that we have looked at. And every one of those studies, with the exception of the one that I just showed you by Peter Brown with the ponderosa pine, is driven by disturbance. Old growth forests are the product of disturbance. Okay, so this is just a bit of a sample here. We've got studies from New Hampshire in the northeastern US, from New Zealand, from British Columbia and Washington, from northwestern Russia, from Thailand, from Europe, from China, from Chile, from Tasmania, from the north central states in the US. We've got angiosperms, sort of broadleaf forests. We've got conifer forests. We've got tropical forests. We've got temperate rainforests. We've got just about everything covered. And what we find consistently across the entire set of studies that we've looked at, and I'm not suggesting that's exhaustive, but it is certainly a large proportion of them, is that most, or is that all of these studies suggest that old growth forests are the product of discrete disturbance events, that the disturbance impacts a forest, but is not a stand replacing disturbance, and that the survivors are the trees that go on to be the really the big trees with many of these old growth structural features that we associate with old growth forest. Now, in different parts of the world, there's different types of disturbances. So you've got hurricanes, you've got droughts, insects, wind, you've got fire in many places, and wind in others. But the key thing that I want you to bear in mind here is that disturbance is important in driving a lot of the structural features that we see in old growth forests, and that really many of them are probably better thought of as multi-cohort forests. Okay, so when we looked, you had obviously a minimum of 2, but often as many as 5 age cohorts in the forest. Okay, so it's important then to think about multi-cohort stand development when we think about old growth forests, because it appears that every old growth forest that we've looked at in the literature is a multi-cohort forest, and it's important to sort of think about how is it that multi-cohort stands develop. So this is just a cartoon from the Oliver and Larson book, Forest Dynamics. And if you look here on the right-hand side, this is a single cohort stand, and this is a gradient from right to left of disturbance to the forest canopy, where this is not very much disturbance, the sort of thinning of these suppressed trees. This is a more moderate loss of forest cover, and this is where you just have a couple of trees that remain. And then over here, this would be a complete stand replacing disturbance. That would be similar to clear felling or the very extreme end of catastrophic bushfires. Now, this is an example from the Central Highlands. This is up on Lady Talbot Drive, just east of Marysville. So this is an area that was, if you look at the fire severity mapping, one of the most severely impacted areas of the 2009 Black Saturday fires. These pictures were taken the year after. And even in this part of the landscape, where there was, really catastrophic mortality of the eucalypts and some of the rainforest, you see that there are patches of forest and individual trees that survived. Okay, and if you look very carefully, it depends on the resolution of your computer monitor and the zoom here, you'll notice that the trees that survived are big ones, right? So you can see this big eucalypt through here. There's the big stem back there. This is a big tree. And the trees that died, those ones here with the sort of brownish tops in the foreground, are much smaller trees. And that's something I'm going to keep coming back to in a moment. So Katie Hammond, my other PhD student who's working on some of these questions within the Victorian context, has been working with the 2015-16 LIDAR data in the Central Highlands to try and really understand what were the structural implications of the 2009 bushfire. And so she's classified using LIDAR, she's developed algorithms that can automatically classify the forest structure into one of three groups. So you have full canopy, where there's no obvious sort of impact of the fire on the canopy. Partial canopy, where there's some trees are there and others are not. So these are, 20 by 20 meter pixels. And then no canopy, where there was forest before, but there is maybe evidence of trees, but clearly trees that don't have sort of foliar cover in them. And then she can, once she's classified the pixels, she can then map the pixels. So here you have a map. So there's this sort of upside down F of pixels that have full canopy cover like this. The sort of larger area of the middle shade of green that have partial canopy cover. So they look like this. Some trees survived, not all necessarily did. And then the lighter green here, where all of the trees would have been killed. There's no canopy cover left. Okay, and we can look at that at larger scale. So this is a 1 square kilometer tile. So it's a kilometer across the bottom and a kilometer up and down the sides. And what you notice here is that the impacts of the 2009 bushfires are extraordinarily heterogeneous, right? We think of the 2009 bushfires as this, catastrophic stand replacing disturbance that wiped the slate clean. But in reality, in many parts of this landscape where it impacted the forests, it wasn't clean at all. In fact, it was quite messy. So you have areas like this where there's, quite a bit of full canopy cover. A lot of the forest survived, a lot of the trees survived. But you have areas like this where, a large proportion of the forest, there's no canopy cover. But you'll notice that even in this area that was so severely impacted, there are pixels, there are patches where there are surviving trees, right? So they may be full canopy cover, the dark pixels, or they may be partial canopy cover, which you see in sort of clumps here. And so we see these sort of patches and clumps of survivors. Now, the dendroecological work that we do looks at the trees that survived a disturbance 150 years ago and now are amongst the, the big old growth sort of really impressive trees. This picture here, the trees that survived here in 2009, these are effectively the seeds of what will be the old growth structural features in the future. Okay, so the dendroecological work looks into the past to see what came to the present. This kind of work is looking at what has happened in recent history and anticipating where it's going to go into the future. Okay, and that's, I think, a really important thing to bear in mind when we look at the impacts of natural disturbances on our landscapes. Whether that's Victoria, whether that's British Columbia, Western Washington, Northeast United States, it doesn't matter. The basic idea holds in any place where you have large catastrophic disturbances. So the key message that I want you to take away from this middle section of my talk are, number one, old growth forest results from disturbances, not the absence of disturbances. And the dendroecological work on this is unequivocal. Every study that we've looked at has evidence of discrete disturbances that have been driving the dynamics of and the development of old growth forests. And in part, that's largely due to the fact that natural disturbances are messy. right? There are survivors, there are individual trees that survive, there are clumps of trees that survive, and that those surviving elements are the foundation of that multi-cohort structure that we see as the future old growth forests when this happens today, or when it happened in the past. Those are the key elements of what we identify as old growth forests in the present. Okay, so this brings me to the third part of the talk, which is about whether there's a role for forest management in the context of thinking about old growth forests. And so what is the role of forest management here? And I think there's three pieces to this, and other people might have other views on this. But the first one is we should protect the existing old growth forests, right? They're rare, they're unique on the landscapes, and they're not replaceable. Old trees are old trees, and so those should be protected. I think that's a no-brainer, and so I'm not actually going to spend much time talking about that. The other two are, one, we should be retaining clumps and patches on the landscape when we manage, right? Those are trees that would have established in the past. By leaving them, they obviously have a huge head start in terms of getting to size, getting to larger sizes, and being the elements of future old growth forest. And here I'm really thinking about the role of forest management here as effectively restoring structures that are rare on the landscape, and using some of the tools and knowledge that we have of forest dynamics. And then the third piece here is we need to grow trees bigger, faster. Okay, so those are the three things I think we should be thinking about when we think about forest management in the context of old growth forests. As I said, I'm not going to talk about the first one because I think that's self-evident, and so there's not much to say on it. I will talk a little bit about the next two, however. So I want to talk about what do we mean when we're talking about retaining clumps and patches, and what are the outcomes of that. So it's worth pointing out that Australia and Australian foresters and forest scientists have really been at the cutting edge of thinking about what we call retention-based harvesting. So where we retain clumps of trees. So for example, you see here down in the bottom, big patches of forest or individual trees sort of scattered through here. So this is from the Warra silvicultural systems trials, the Warra LTR in Southwest Tasmania. And this has been really a fantastic long-term study that has informed globally management about forest retaining, sort of, I guess, retention-based silviculture in forested landscapes. We're now beginning to see that being those types of retention systems used here in Victoria. We're seeing them used in New South Wales and elsewhere. And I think, as I said, we see in natural disturbance, we see patches of forest that survive even in the most severe parts of the landscape. And so it's really important that if we are going to have our silviculture in any way aligned with natural processes, that we should also be trying to do that, where we leave patches that survive so that they carry these structural elements, compositional elements through into the future. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of Katie Hammond's work because we're very fortunate here in Victoria that we have a long-term study that was it wasn't initiated to look at these questions, but now 30 years on allows us to look at some of these things. So we have a silvicultural systems trial here in Victoria. There's two, one at Tangel Bren in the Central Highlands and one at Cabbage Tree Creek in East Gippsland. And as part of Katie's PhD work, she's revisited the Tangel Bren sites and looked to see what is the impacts of putting in different silvicultural systems on forest structure. This is just a pretty picture of one of the sites there with you'll see some large mountain ash there in the foreground. So the silvicultural systems trial was established in the late 1980s. The harvesting was done in 89, 90, 91. They put in a range of different silvicultural prescriptions. So you had small gaps, you had medium-sized gaps, you had large gaps, you had clear fell, which was the sort of standard treatment at the time. You had seed trees, which is where you leave a few individual trees in the canopy, but really quite sparse. And then they had a couple of what we call retention treatments, where they retained 30% of the overstory or 50% of the overstory. And then there were controls where there was no harvesting involved. And the pictures here, you're looking up in the sky, are clear fell on the left, one of the retention treatments in the middle, and then the small gap on the right. So what Katie has done is she's gone into these plots and into these management areas and sampled the forest structure and composition to see what happened now 30 years on after these different treatments. And she has a very rich body of work that she's been compiling. I'm going to just focus on two pieces of it because I'm cognizant of the time. The first one is looking at biomass, because that's an important element of old growth forests. And the second one is tree size. So these are the different treatments on the y-axis. This is biomass in megagrams, metric tons per hectare. And what you see is that the control, so this is all 1939 regrowth forest, is the matrix in which this was conducted. And the 50% retention have around 550, 600 megagrams per hectare of biomass. So that's right in the middle of where you would expect old growth forests to be in the Central Highlands. There's certainly some that are higher, and there are some that are lower. The 30% retention is a little bit further down. It's around 400 megagrams per hectare, but still, getting to be pretty substantial amounts of biomass. The other treatments here are substantially lower. When we look at the size of individual trees, and we're interested in this because, as we talked about in the first piece of my talk, large living trees are an important structural feature of old growth forests. We see that these three treatments, the control and the two retention treatments, have some very large trees on them. Okay, so the 30% retention, so 70% of the trees were harvested, but 30% of the overstory was left. Those trees that were left have gotten to be, really, really big trees. Okay, so this is 1939 regrowth, so it's 80 years on now. And you're looking at, trees that are 120, 130 centimeters in diameter. Okay, so these are big, big trees. And so those structural elements that we associate with old growth forest are beginning to develop because of this retention approach that we took in terms of the silviculture. Okay, and so that's an important thing to bear in mind. The third thing that I want to talk about in terms of forest management is growing trees bigger, faster. And some of you may have heard me talk about this in other places, but it's a point I'd like to reiterate here. This is the picture from Mount Buffalo National Park in 2008. That's me for scale next to the tree. This is a mountain gum. And what you'll notice here, this is after the 2007 alpine bushfires, that the big trees survived and the little trees did not. Okay, so there's some of the little trees have a few leaves on them, but the big trees clearly, much, much more vigorous in terms of having gotten through this fire. And this is something that we are well aware of from many, many parts of the world, is that big trees have a higher probability of surviving disturbances, in particular fires. And so this is some work that my postdoc, Raphael Trouvé, has recently published. And basically, what this shows is, this is just for Eucalyptus radiata, we've done this for other species as well, the probability of mortality on the x-axis, so 1 means 100% probability of dying, and size, diameter, breast height on the y-axis, on the x-axis. As the trees get bigger, the probability declines, the probability of dying declines, okay? These different lines are different fire intensities, so this is a low intensity fire in the light color, and this is a very high intensity fire in the red. And in all cases, the bigger the tree gets, the lower the probability of dying in the fire. Obviously, it differs across the different types of fire. But because of this, we really are I think, need to focus on, what does it take to get trees bigger faster? And I say this because when we think about the development of old growth, there's really two pieces that emerge from the tree ring work. And one is disturbances are part of the deal. All old growth forests that we've studied as a gender ecological community show evidence of disturbance. But survivors are important. The second piece is really critical. You have to get some of the trees through the disturbance, okay? So what we need to be thinking about is what's going to increase the probability of surviving a disturbance, or in this case, decrease the probability of mortality. And so this is just an example. So one thing that we think about is using thinning. So you reduce the density of a stand, focuses the resources on the trees that remain. They grow bigger, faster. We saw that with Katie's work from Tanjo Bren. So this is just an example that we did. This is a unthinned stand of mountain ash prior to a fire. This is a thin stand on the right-hand side. You'll notice that these trees are bigger, right? So most of them are over 100 centimeters in diameter, whereas almost none of them are that size here. If we run a fire of a given intensity through that stand and look at which trees are killed, you see that most of the small trees and quite a few of the moderate-sized trees in the control unthinned site die, so quite substantial mortality. Whereas in the thin stand, almost none of the trees die. Right? They're bigger trees, they have a higher probability of surviving or a lower probability of dying in fire. And so one of the things that's really important to think about is if we can get trees bigger faster, it gets them out of that sort of period of susceptibility sooner, right? And so when a disturbance comes, the probability that you would have individual trees surviving to then be those old growth sort of structural elements in the future is really critically important to doing, to achieving that. Now, this is another piece of work that our postdoc, Raphael Trouvé, published. This just came out a couple of weeks ago. And one of the places that we can have some impact is in the way we regenerate forests after we harvest. So on the left, you see the spatial pattern of seedling density after clear fell, burn, and sow, the standard prescription here in Victoria. And what you'll notice, obviously, is it's very uniform. Roughly a seedling per a seedling or a little bit less than a seedling per square meter. Whereas after the 2009 bushfires, what you'll notice here is that the pattern is much, much more variable. You have areas of very high density and areas of very low density, right? So there's no seedlings through here, and then there's big bunches of seedlings here. And only one seedling is going to emerge to become a tree here and here and here, right? They'll compete for resources, and one will be dominant. So you wind up with much lower but more variable density in these forests after natural disturbance than you do after we sow after clear felling. Well, why does this matter? It matters because the variability that we create in the regeneration has long-term influences on stand development. And so these are growth series from long-term inventory plots that have been managed over the years by the Forest Commission and its post-cursors. And so you've got different ages here. So this younger forest, 27 years old, and then these ones are in the 50s, and this is 70-year-old stands. The left-hand column is dense regeneration, typical of what you would see after clear felling, and the right-hand column is regeneration that is low density and variable in its arrangement. And in each case, you'll see that the distribution of sizes is wider and the average size is bigger. Okay, so that by the time you get down here, 68 years on, so this was 1939 regrowth when these were measured, you have trees, a number of trees over that 100 centimeter size limit, and you've got a broad range of size classes, whereas here you have a narrower range, and only the one tree over here that's exceeded that size threshold. So again, if you have a fire come through here, there's much greater chance of widespread mortality here, and there's much greater chance of some trees surviving through here. And that's because that variable density gives some individuals more resources to grow, and they get to be bigger faster. Okay. So the key messages that I want you to take away from this third section of the talk around forest management is that forest management can accelerate the development of structural features of old growth. Now, I don't want to in any way to suggest that some of the aspects around old trees and trees that are simply old are things that can be substituted by doing this. But a lot of the definitions and features that we associate with old growth are structural, right? Big pieces of wood on the ground or standing large trees. And so those are things that forest management can help influence in the future. And that's important because we have very little landscape that is in the old growth forest now, and we have a lot of landscape that is in second growth or disturbed. And that forest, we do have some potential to effectively restore towards more old growth type structures. But to do that, our forest management needs to be messier, right? We've been, as forest science community, focusing on how do we make things as homogeneous and efficient as possible. And the reality is we need to sort of move in the other direction. We need to make our disturbances messier, and we need to be less efficient in terms of what we're taking out of the forest, whether that is in leaving patches or clumps of trees, whether that is in having much more variable regeneration in the forest. All of that will contribute to the heterogeneity of the forest, which will allow more trees to get through disturbances and then provide the sort of seed features for future old growth forest. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I think we've got a little bit of time left, and I will just shout out to Harvard University and the Bullard Fellowship that's enabled me to do some of this, and also an early future fellowship that got me thinking about a lot of these things. And then to many of my colleagues, not all of whom are listed here, from University of Melbourne, from UTAS, and Harvard University Forest, who've been very helpful and instrumental in thinking about some of these ideas. And so with that, I will leave you with a gorgeous snow gum from Kosciuszko National Park, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Patrick, for this inspiring talk on old growth forests. And we have time for questions. Given that this is a webinar, we can't have live questions, but I'll ask you to put your questions into the Q&A function in there, and not in the chat, please. So we have one question, which is close to my heart as well, and that's around the nature of the disturbance. Patrick, you mentioned mainly fire as a disturbance. And Deborah Evans asked, can long droughts be equivalent to a disturbance as we are defining it here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so yeah, the short answer is absolutely. And certainly what we saw in 2017, 2018 in Eastern Australia, what we've been seeing for years in the Southwestern United States, we've been seeing big drought impacts in Europe over the last decade. These are quite dramatic disturbances, but they fit very nicely into this model, because typically droughts don't kill everything, right? There are trees that get through droughts within the landscape, and it may be because they are in the right piece of the landscape and they have better access to water. It might be because of their personal history, growth history. They have, deeper roots that are able to allow them to survive. And so any disturbance that sort of allows some of the trees to survive, which effectively is every type of disturbance that we know, fits into this model pretty well.
One question that came up, and I have a similar question, is, you mentioned that it's logical that we should protecting old growth forests. But the question is really, how do you protect old growth forests? Would you put them in conservation reserves? And what sort of forest management practices would you suggest are required to protect actually old growth forests?
Yeah, so I might have been a little bit lazy with the word protect. I think protect in the sense that we can protect them from harvesting, right? So we don't go and cut them down. I don't think that we can protect old growth forests from, for example, here in Southeastern Australia, from fire. I think the 2019-20 fire season, particularly with the prospects of climate change in the future, has been a big eye-opener in the sense that there's not a lot of these landscapes that will ever be really immune to the potential threat of fire and loss of fire. And so we can prevent human, direct human activities such as harvesting in old growth forests. And I think that's where a lot of the regulations already are. And I think that's something that is worth, really thinking about carefully. But protecting forests from disturbance is an entirely different problem. And I think at one level, you can do that through some of the management of the second growth forests. But I do want to make the point that protection here is, I guess I think about it in a different way. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get something to survive through the disturbance. We can't protect all of the trees. We can't, sort of put a bubble around these forests. Natural disturbances are certainly part of the system. Disturbances are becoming more frequent. That's a real concern. Tom Fairman, who's back with us here at the University of Melbourne, has been doing some fantastic work on that over the years. But all we can do is load the dice, right? We want to have some trees that are able to better persist through disturbances, and that I think is something that we can do.
All right, thank you, Patrick, and thanks everybody for your questions. We have many, many more questions in the Q&A and also in the chat. Unfortunately, our time is up. It's now past 2 o'clock. So I would like to thank Patrick again for this inspiring talk, and everybody who has a question, maybe contact Patrick by email. So thanks everybody who attended this seminar as part of Science Week. And just as a reminder, our regular seminar series always happens during semester at this time slot. So check out the CEF's webpage and look for the events so you can see what's on next week. Thanks everybody, and goodbye.